and welcome to FinCrimeTV. This is Chinwags with the Old Codgers Club. I'm Julia Chin. In this episode, we continue with our discussion on transaction monitoring. I wanted to address the question of the relationship between staff and machines, how we teach the people in the office to generate more accurate alerts and more effective transaction monitoring. So let's get on topic this time. So let me start with Nigel.
We don't want the staff to generate alerts, just to contradict your introduction. We want staff to give the correct data. Let's not call it data, that makes it scary. Let's just call it information. We want the people in the office to give the correct information to the computer so the computer can accurately analyze what it is given. Now that's fine until we reach the point where the data is given by the customer, but let's not divert ourselves with that particular problem. Let's look at making sure that the staff that are either obtaining or checking that data, that information, do so on a consistent basis, so the machines can be programmed to look at information on a consistent basis and therefore produce alerts on a consistent basis. That's really at the heart of where it's all going so horribly wrong, mostly.
The data that's required for human intervention and to be able to understand it is called know your client. And again, I keep going back to a phrase that's been about for a few years from someone, I can't remember who it was, who talks about it's not know your client, it's understand your client. That's where the human needs to look at what the machine is doing, understand what the machine is doing, and actually you can't just understand what is coming out from a machine is the correct answer. It's the interpretation, and that's where we need interpretation. I've talked about it before where, you know, a drug dealer's on a corner, and just because somebody on the corner hands something to somebody else doesn't necessarily mean that it's a drug transaction going on. It's interpretation, it's understanding that reliance on the machine will, in my opinion, invite inconsistencies if you're not careful, particularly with respect to customer due diligence and the know your client. So I think you need to be aware that you're training your staff to think laterally as well, to understand exactly what the machine is doing and what is coming out, and to be able to understand it in that way. You cannot throw away human intuition as far as I'm concerned. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's definitely that we cannot throw away the human intervention. And so comes my next question is, how, Mark, how do I train my team to be able to think outside the box when it comes to investigating?
Carefully is the snide answer, but the practical stuff is going to be based around a couple of things. I think you need to have in any organization a cadre of specialists who have the experience both of the system and are comfortable operating it and know its limitations, and have experience in what customers and clients get up to perfectly legitimately, and then sometimes when you've really got an issue. Now, I've never held myself out as a fraud expert, so this is why I find particularly Des very interesting in what he actually does and how he does it. The issue for me in the how is relaying examples from what has gone well in the system, highlighting the areas where you will have to use more judgment than just automatically taking what the computer says is accurate, being comfortable in talking with clients around difficult situations, a set of skills that a lot of people are not comfortable with. As soon as they get an alert, some of them will panic, some of them will go, I want nothing to do with this. And you need, therefore, to have a degree of patience, I think, in repeating the story consistently through the organization to set your expectations. And finally, I don't know whether this is a function of my aging, but you need to stamp out fairly quickly because the computer says so answers. Because that gets rid of all the responsibility onto what may not be well understood. Julia?
Yes, this is where I want to also understand how far can we say it was what the computer generated. How admissible is that in court? Okay, let's not even debate that. The other concern that I have is really, when we have an alert that comes in, how I think one challenge that we face is reaching out to the customer to ask for information without being seen as tipping off. Possibly, when Mark, you mentioned about the concern with reaching out to the customers is people tend not to want to do that because they might be seen as tipping off. Back to you, Mark, before I get Des and Nigel's opinion on this.
Well, I'd hope to give somebody else that headache and to be caught by hoist by my own petard, so to speak. It's really quite tricky. It takes a degree of confidence of what is going on around you. You need to know not only the system, but you need to know that reasonable inquiry is not tipping off. An example of tipping off would be, we've had an inquiry from the tax inspectors. Can you explain what's going on? No. You want something much more around, we're doing a review of what's tax behavior is amongst our clients. I wonder if you can just go over what advice you received, what's been going on, any copies you may need of any sort of information. But it's the sort of conversation. Now, again, I'm focusing it back onto the UK, so forgive me for this. At the beginning of the new tipping off regime introduced at the beginning of the noughties, the regulators said, we will be with you when you have to answer an inquiry when you've raised a suspicious activity report. Then they worked out how many SARs were actually being produced and promptly backpedaled from that. And so it is absolutely dependent upon your specialists within the organization to be able to brief and hold the hands of, where necessary, your front officers of sufficient responsibility to help them go through these inquiries. Does that actually answer your question, or have I just set up a couple of landmines for everybody else?
You set up some food for thought, something that I need to think about as I go along this journey of preparing myself to ask customers questions. So, Nigel, when it comes to reliance on the system, how far can we say that we rely on the system or defer to the systems when it comes to as a defense of whether if we were to miss out on any alerts?
If we rely on false positives, we are not protected by the law where there is a claim by the customer, because the reports that we make to the FIU are protected provided they are made in good faith. And I do not believe that if we simply say the computer said so, that is good faith. So that's the first problem. The second is relating to false negatives. These are not protected where laundering actually happens. We cannot go to court and say the computer said so, so I'm not guilty, because the computer doesn't think. The law says if you know or suspect or know or believe that there is money laundering, then various consequences flow depending upon which bits of law or regulation you're dealing with. And so the computer said so doesn't work.
So having high dependency on artificial intelligence therefore does not work. Okay, let's not get there. Dev, what are your thoughts?
I think I'm walking along the same road that Nigel is with this, in that the approach that I'm looking at, the results that come from a machine, I think if I define them, you may have used this phrase. I know both of us talked about this before, Nigel. The results that come from a machine, for me, are a puzzle. And with a puzzle, you should know exactly what you're missing. But actually, the results that you're getting out of a machine is actually a mystery. And with a mystery, you don't even know if there's a puzzle out there to solve. Are you trying to understand the logic of a machine, or are you trying to apply the logic of the result that's coming out? That's the most important part, and goes back to your the difference that Nigel talks about when it's false positives or false negatives. It's understanding it. Please don't just read the results and act on those without understanding how it got there. Is it a puzzle or is it a mystery? Julia?
So KYC stands for Know Your Customer and Know Your Computer. So I think I have a lot of questions in my mind, but I don't know what to ask first. So why don't I pass back to Mark for some thoughts?
Thank you very much. I've obviously got to keep Julia happy. She keeps coming back to me. Why are we introducing these systems, or why have these systems been introduced? They've been introduced to help identify what's going on, but to bring consistency, a large part of it, across our decision making. And I'm not going to quibble with Nigel or Des on how you should approach the output. I think it's a very good idea. I really do like what parts from this puzzle are actually missing. The trouble is that financial institutions make much more money if they, how can I put this professionally, reduce the burden of professional learning and therefore don't have to pay people as much to do a similar job over time. And you know, when front offices have different competing requirements on their time and on their profitability, I worry that as soon as they get an alert, and I have seen this happen, they pass it off to the central specialists and then go, it's got nothing to do with me. But in fact, they are key to understanding what the relationship with the customer is like. Now, that's great if you actually have a client relationship officer, but where you have a large publicly facing retail offering, and particularly, let's link it back to some of our previous videos, the unbanked, or those who are struggling to get access to financial services, how do you get the information to fill in the holes in that puzzle? And I think, particularly with the law is written badly, again in the UK, and I'm going to come back to it because I think they've done some really good stuff, but a lot of it, they shot themselves in the foot, where you put MLROs in a situation where an SAR goes to them, and the only defense that they have is to, in law, is to upwardly forward that SAR, then you've got a problem. And so, yeah, it comes down to knowing your client, knowing your computer system. I love that one. But how do you actually do it in real life? And I'm still struggling with that. I'm not ashamed to say. But I'm sure Nigel and Des will have some much better ideas.
I'm pretty sure it's a form of forensic science that we're actually getting into now. And I'm not a scientist, but I know there's something called Locard's principle, in forensic science, which actually talks about the perpetrator of a crime will bring something to the crime scene and leave with something from it, and that both can be found within forensic science. And that's the kind of thing that you've got to look at when you're looking at what's coming out of the machines doing something. Maybe the bottom line is that your compliance analysis analysts, your AML team, anybody within your compliance team has got to start thinking instead of just following what the regulations say. Understanding your client, looking at what's happening and doing an analysis of it. That's what I think, Julia.
Can I jump actually specifically on what you were saying in the middle of what you've just said? There is a real problem in that the people at various stages in the process are given KPIs or some such, especially in call centers, where they have a very tight time limit on how long they're able to spend on an individual call or on their reaction to that individual call. They don't have the time because whoever set those systems hasn't allowed the time within their requirements to think about it. So they are literally saying, I don't like this, pass it up the line. And until such time as the importance of allowing that person on the front line, be it in a call center or on the desk in a physical branch, until such time as someone says, we appreciate that there are times when you're going to have to bust that time limit, and we're going to allow you the discretion to do that, we're never going to see the objective that you would like to see, Des.
Good point on that, Nigel. I think time is always not on our side, and with a lot of operations or what do you call it, center of excellence and centers of excellence, they talk about key performance indexes that tie back to time, and this is an area that is possibly worth exploring. Is to relook and revisit how we develop the key performance indices rather than to just build it on time or in something along that line. And with that, I think time is up. And thank you, gentlemen, until the next episode.